Hi everyone, Roger Capello here, bringing you my week at the club, and I guess for this particular segment, the astronomy segment, my astro tidbit of the week. I wanted to talk about something I would call the myth of infrared, and that's it. That I think there's a real common misconception about what infrared really is. So we're all familiar with infrared light. If you look at a glowing fireplace, it doesn't throw out much light, but from those embers. But if you stand in front of it, you get pretty warm. So there's clearly a lot of heat that's being transmitted by something that's not visible, and of course, it's infrared light. And you can build devices to receive infrared light, just like you can visible light or X-rays or gamma rays or anything else. And if you look at those, you get a different picture than you would with your eye. So if you look at a hot cup of liquid and a cold cup of liquid, they look quite different in infrared. You can really see that region where the heat is being emitted there in the infrared. Also, if you look at a house, if you do a insulation survey to see whether or not your house is properly insulated, and they come with an infrared camera, they'll take some pictures and they can see where the infrared light, where the heat is leaking out. So at the top of the windows is a place anywhere around the windows. The windows themselves are fairly leaky in terms of heat, and so they're emitting infrared radiation. If you look at something more interesting, like a person or a dog, you'll see a different picture, but it gives you a lot of the same information. So you look at this dog, and you can see that the fur on their back is pretty thick, and there's not much heat that's being lost through the fur on their back. But their belly is pretty thin here, and so is their face. Their nose is cold. I should point out that these pictures are all what astronomers would call false color photographs, where different colors are used to depict the intensity of the infrared light. So they aren't really colors, but they're giving you the information about whether it's more intense or less intense. And of course, the more intense regions are the red areas, and less intense are the blues and purples. When I looked at that dog, I realized it's sort of interesting that dogs are built the way they are. They can't put clothes on or take them off to adjust their body heat. But one thing they can do is adjust their posture when they're on the ground. So they have all this nice fur on their back, which insulates them very well, and their belly is quite uninsulated. And so if they expose more of their belly, and even when it gets hot, I see my dogs lying on their back, they get rid of a lot of heat that way. When it's cold, they just flop over the other way, and they're nicely insulated. So it's a kind of a clever strategy. Anyway, why do I call infrared a myth? Well, because people have this notion that infrared is how heat is transmitted. That is, if you have sunlight, that the light comes from the sun in the visible band where our eyes can see, but that the heat comes in the infrared. And that's only partially true. That's not really the fundamental truth. And in fact, there's more energy that comes out in the visible part of the band than there is in the infrared, except for the fact that the infrared extends for a very long way. The infrared definition of infrared is that if you look at the electromagnetic spectrum, it extends for a wide range of wavelengths. It's about 10 octaves or so of frequency coverage, whereas visible light's only 1 octave, and so the visible band is narrower and the infrared is wider. And so even though the infrared in the spectrum of the sun that we looked at last week is less intense, it actually adds up to be almost about as much total energy as comes in the visible. But certainly for a brighter star, the dominating influence in the heat is in the visible or even in the ultraviolet. And so it just depends on where the peak of that black body curve is. If you look at an incandescent light bulb, the spectrum of that you can see is such that the peak is actually outside of the visible band. The peak is actually in the infrared. And it's one reason why incandescent bulbs are so inefficient is because most of the radiation comes in a region that's not terribly useful for reading the evening newspaper. A candle emits mostly in the infrared. So cool things like dogs or even up to candles or incandescent light bulbs are infrared principally infrared emitters, but things that are visible light, like a white hot glowing piece of iron out of a blast furnace or the sun or something like that, most of the heat is going to come in the visible range. So that's the myth of infrared, and now I'd like to get onto the chess, or at least I think I'd like to, but I'm not sure how much of a treat it is, or more interestingly, more of an anatomy of a train wreck or something that I have to show to you this week. Well, it's never fun to analyze a loss, especially one that's in the first round of a tournament and you're getting paired 380 points down, but I got outplayed. And so I should show you this nice game that Steve Murray played against me on Wednesday night. It just took me a few days to get over the shock of it. So I played a French defense against his e4 opening, and he played kind of an unusual setup. Usually white plays e4 and d4 immediately. But this isn't horrible. I mean, it's some games have been played in this, and I was tempted here to play d4, driving his knight back. But of course, the problem with something like that is that it can quickly undermine my pawn center. It's a little overextended, and I can quickly have to go on the defensive trying to maintain that pawn at d4. And instead of doing that, I decided what I would do is to play a fairly normal move, knight to f6, and inviting his e5, and this then gets me into a position that looks a lot like a normal classical French, except that the knights are not necessarily on their best squares, and so it's a little awkward for him then to hold up his pawn center, which is the way you want to have it be when you're playing the French defense. So he played knight to e2. At this point already, I think black has a slight advantage. He's definitely equalized out of the opening. The pieces are developing a little more smoothly. The only possible problem for black here maybe is developing that late squared bishop that's so often a problem in the French. And so thematically, I continue to put pressure onto this d4 square. Oops, not that d4 square. Let's try this one. There we go. So that, of course, has 3 attacks on it now with the knight and the pawn and the queen. It's defended well enough, but it's definitely starting to feel pressured. And in particular, that this queen move keeps his bishop at home for a while, because otherwise the b pawn would go undefended. So he replied with what's a pretty unusual move. There's only one game in the database where white played this out of about 40 games, and in that game black won, but not playing it the way that I played it. So a sensible thing to do here, I think, is probably just to go ahead and accept the queen trade, which I looked at during the game, and there are a couple of ways to trade queens here. One is the sort of more active way of doing it, which is to initiate the queen trade, and then he takes back, and I didn't like the idea of this line if I traded pawns now, CD, CD, because he gets play along these 2 open files. Even though he has these weak pawns, the weak double B pawns, one could argue that the pawn on B3 stands better than it did when it was on A2, because a pawn on the edge rank is really not very strong. Only has one direction to capture. And it turns out that wouldn't even be my best. A better move would be to just play b6, supporting my c pawn, and giving my bishop an avenue to get out into the game, either through a6 or possibly b7. I did not do that. And I also didn't do the other idea, which is to exchange pawns here and let him initiate the queen trade. And this is actually better than I thought it was, because what I didn't do is actually I analyzed this line to about this point. I didn't look at the continuation knight b4, and of course that opens up this threat on c2, which is a little hard to meet, and white actually has to move his king to an awkward square, and along the way black also wins the a pawn. So this is actually a bit in black's favor. So that should have been another thing that I considered doing, but I didn't see that knight b4 move. So instead, I just retreated my queen to where he couldn't trade it off, arguing that maybe his queen would be poorly placed on b3. And what he did on his very next move actually sort of rewarded me with that strategy. He played knight g3, presumably starting to develop a kingside attack with his knights over there, and also allowing his bishop to come out along the light square diagonal. But the problem is that there's a little tactical shot that black can play, and I saw it. It's initiated by pawn takes pawn, and after he takes back, I can check on the dark square diagonal. And now he has a little bit of a problem. If he comes back with his knight, this d pawn falls, and that would be very bad in this position with my knight attacking d4, and then after I take the d pawn, attacking his queen. He could block with the bishop, which is what he did do, but then when I trade bishops off, now if he recaptures with the knight, again the d pawn would fall. So he actually has to take with the king. And now his king is stuck in the center very early in the game, which is not great, but it's I think it's optically worse than it really is, because it's difficult for black to really get his pieces out to where they can attack that king that's stuck in the center. And white only has to develop his bishop and then move his rooks to the center, and he can castle by hand pretty easily. What I probably should have done was more aggressively tried to get my rooks into the game, and well, you'll see how that happens. So I castled, which is, I think, a good move in this position. He played bishop d3, which certainly makes sense. He wants his rooks connected and get them out onto the open files. And here's where I went a little bit astray. I came out with a queen check, hoping that something would happen like what did happen, which is he would block with the queen. He doesn't really have that many. I mean, otherwise, my queen and knights might actually start to cause problems for his king in the center. I figured, he could block with the queen. And if I traded the queens off, maybe he would take back with the b pawn. And if he did that, that would not be very good for him, I think, because this knight could come out to a5, which would take control of this c4 square. And then my next move would be to move this other knight to b6, which would reinforce my control of this c4 square and allow me to stick a knight there. This would be very bad for him, but what he did was just the correct thing, which was after the trade to take back with the king. Now, why did I come out? I mean, what was the other reason for doing this other than just hoping that he might, make a positional error? I was a bit worried about the kingside attack. So what I was looking at back in this position was, if I made a line such as, or made a move such as b6, trying to get my dark squared bishop into the game through b7 maybe, that he might do something like bishop takes h7 check, and when my king takes, the knight can come to g5 check, king back to g8, and then queen to d3, threatens checkmate on h7. But that is actually not quite as bad as it seems. I figured I would have to block with g6, and that he would play his knight into h5. And I think this is about where I stopped analyzing in my head, thinking that I really didn't like the looks of, this weak's. I can't take the knight, obviously, because there's this checkmate threat on h7. All right, the queen is going to come in here for mate if the pawn moves. And his knight will come in at some point, maybe to f6 check. If I trade off the knights, he has a strong pawn. He takes back with it, f6. That all looked a bit dangerous to me. But, Stockfish points out that there's a strong counter sack that I just play knight takes e5. Attacking his queen, he has to do something, about that immediate threat. And presumably he takes back with the pawn, and then I take with the queen. And now my queen, he no longer has a threat of knight f6 check. And I've got everything sort of adequately defended, I think. And he's down a piece. So this actually would have been, close to a winning advantage for black. And so I really should have analyzed this line a bit more deeply. But I didn't. I played the queen a5, and after he interposed the queen, I traded the queens off. And now this game starts to get awkward for black. And you'll see how that happens. Okay, I developed my knight over. It seemed reasonable to bring his knights over to where his king was. But of course, it's very easily prevented with b3, which covers the two entry squares for that knight. But part of the reason for me to move that knight was to give my bishop a square to get developed to. He centralized his rook. I centralized my rook. Now at this point I may have, I did consider playing rook f to c1 in this position, and I think that that may have been better. If I really wanted to play on the queen side, this is more reasonable with the idea then of following up with a5. But I didn't do that. Instead I played the a rook there. And he very simply started to run away with the king, and not to the queen side, which is sort of where I expected he would go, but actually toward the center and his original king side. Of course, that allowed me to play my knight up, but it's a bit of an empty threat. He just defends the pawn. But that, this is all my play here with the knights really is centered around trying to get my light squared bishop out of its tomb there, stuck behind the French pawn structure. So now it's finally on a half decent diagonal here, the f1 a6 diagonal, and has some hope of being useful in the game. He can drive my knight away, but that's fine. My bishop has escaped jail, and now we come to probably my best winning chance in the game. This is a tactical mistake by white, and I looked at this position for 12 minutes. So I had 47 minutes left, and I used 12 of them. It took me down to 35 minutes, so I got down to 2/3 of my time already used up in the game. And I analyzed, the sort of obvious combination here, which is to go ahead and take the d-pawn with my knight, undermining the defense of this rook. And the problem, of course, for white is that if he were to play rook takes rook, I can simply play knight takes knight check as a Zwischenzug. He has to do something. He has nothing better than to take back my knight, and then I take back the rook, and I've won a pawn during that tactic. So that would have been fine for me. But the problem is that in this line, after I play knight takes d4, and he could just play knight takes d4 instead of playing rook takes rook. And I didn't like the looks of this line, because after it seems like he couldn't do this, because I can just simply take the rook, and now if you do a body count, I'm ahead of rook for a knight, and I've got this extra passed pawn on d5. But the problem that I just couldn't solve in my head, and which is why I took 12 minutes thinking about it, was that he can play b4. And now my rook has to move off of the fifth rank here, and it's crucial to the defense of my bishop. And so I did look at knight takes c4 check. I figured his king would go back to a square where I couldn't check him again easily, like e1. And then what I looked at in my head was retreating my rook either to c7 or c8, probably to c8, because I figured he would be taking my bishop next, and I couldn't see anything very good coming out of this position. Stockfish pointed out that what I should have done up. Let's get back here into position where we were really at. Was that after the pawn goes to b4, drop my rook. Drop my rook back to c6, which looks bad. But if he plays knight takes rook, I recapture the knight, and I've won a, we've both given up a rook, and I've won a pawn in the deal. So that would, and have that strong passed pawn. That would be very good for, something like this would be very good for black. So he wouldn't do that. Instead, he'd go ahead and take that bishop that I was worried about. But the problem is I can just attack the knight. The knight would have to move. If he defends it, I just simply attack it with a pawn, and then when it moves, I take the pawn that's behind it. So he moves the knight, and now I get the a pawn. Attacking his loose bishop, the bishop has to move, and now I get the b pawn. So, this is working 3 pawns for black against 2 minor pieces for white. And so it's definitely a strong advantage for black. Plus those A and B connected pass pawns on the queen side here are going to be really hard to handle for white. So I wish I'd done that, but shoulda, coulda, woulda. I didn't do that. Instead, after a lot of thought, I just dropped the bishop back to a6. And this is not a losing move, but it keeps me from being having a strong advantage to having about an even game. Gives him time to double on the c file, so now that combination doesn't work anymore. His rook is defended. I came back and attacked it, and probably not my strongest move, because he can simply drop it back. And then I didn't really like the looks of this position. What I had been thinking about doing was dropping my other knight back so that I had a double defense on my rook on c8, which would be fine if he traded rooks there, but the problem is he's not required to trade rooks. He could just play rook c7 and get on the 7th rank, and I'm almost losing a piece here. I'm not quite losing a piece, but it's not very pretty either for black. So this is definitely an advantage to white here if I went down this line. So instead of playing my knight to e7, I just played that other knight back to b6 with the idea that, at least on this square, it defends that rook twice, so that my c knight is no longer pinned. He moved his king, and I came out and attacked this b pawn. Now, the idea was that if the rook moves at some point, I could try to win this pawn. With his king back on the other square, I actually would have won it with tempo, which would have been nice, and forked his king and rook besides. But he defended that pawn on b3. So I traded a pair of rooks, and then played my other rook to the c file, just because I felt his rooks were more active than mine, and that it would be to my advantage to get them out of the way. He defended with his knight, and so in this position now, if I trade rooks, that just develops his knight into my position. So instead I traded my bishop for his knight. That might not have been a great move. This bishop is not as bad as it was. It's a little awkwardly placed over here that, at some point the pawns could trap it, it looks like. And the other thing is these pawns on f7, e6, and d5 are all on white squares. So I felt that bishop wasn't great, so I went ahead and traded it. Maybe not the best idea, because he just simply trades off rooks as a sufficient zug. I have to take back, and then he takes the bishop. And now with the bishop and a knight against my 2 knights, he has a slight pull in the endgame. But black should be able to hold, I think. I just didn't play the endgame well. I played knight to e7, bishop to d3. I played here to try to restrict him from using that b5 square with his bishop. He attacked my knight, and so I had to drop back with that. He defended his d-pawn. I started to centralize my king, Now, this looks like I'm just dropping my h-pawn, but of course, if he were to do that, that's sort of a Fisher mistake, right? Because black can just go ahead and trap that pawn by, or trap the bishop rather, by pushing his pawn. And now, after king to g7, that bishop will be lost. So instead, Steve didn't do anything so silly like that. He played his knight to b3, where now he's threatening to come into either a5 or this very strong c5 square for him. And at this point, I decided to put to rest the possibilities of him winning the h-pawn. I mean, I still didn't need to in order to move my king. I could have moved my king at this point, and if he took that pawn, he's still trapped. But I was getting short on time, and I didn't want to analyze this line. Because there's a chance that this pawn might get over there quickly enough to defend the bishop. And it does. But of course, the problem is that I can simply capture with my pawn, and now his bishop really is trapped. So I didn't like I said, I didn't analyze that over the board, but I just decided to take it out of the running with g6. He played his knight into c5. And I dropped back to defend my b-pawn. The problem is here, if I advance my b-pawn, then my a-pawn is lost, right? So he's attacking not only this b-pawn, but the a-pawn too. So that's why that post is so strong for the knight, not to mention which it's heavily defended there. And if I ever tried to trade it off, he could just take back with a pawn and get a strong passed pawn. So I dropped back with the knight and defended the pawn. And now he starts attacking on the king side. And that's what the next several moves are all about. Here I made a bit of a mistake. And he actually could have made a move that would have been a problem for me. And I actually saw it over the board, and I was glad to see him play f3 here. What he could have done was to play b5, attacking my knight, and also attacking my a-pawn a third time. So I would be required, if I didn't want to lose that pawn, I would be required to exchange pawns. And then he takes back with the bishop, and now my knight is defended, and I'm losing a pawn over here. The immediate threat, is just knight takes pawn. If the knight were so silly as to take back, well, let's say I do something, I don't know, like move my h-pawn. So the threat is to play knight takes pawn, on knight takes knight, bishop takes check, king moves, bishop takes knight. Now he's actually won a whole piece. It doesn't have to be that bad. I can make it so that he only wins a pawn here. But so he plays bishop takes knight, knight takes, and now he wins the pawn. You may wonder, well, why not take with the pawn? Well, the problem is if you take with the pawn, this a-pawn advances, and it's going to be very hard to stop. Black can sacrifice a little material to try to, in the center, to try to move his knight around. Actually, yeah, the king, the line I have here is actually moving the king around over to the, stop the pawn. But it's that was necessary in order to open up this path for the king. I mean, the other possibility after pawn takes pawn, king takes is for him to, or actually, after pawn takes pawn and king, let's go back here a little bit. After pawn takes pawn, if the king were to take the f pawn, then the knight could maneuver itself over here, and get there in time to stop it, I believe. Actually, maybe not. It doesn't. Oh yeah, I forgot, there's a check. Check. And the knight just makes it in time to stop the pawn, but this line is, with that strong pawn, this is not a good line for black. Not something black wants to go into. So If he had played b5, I would have been in trouble here, but he didn't. He played f3, and I was in trouble a different way. So king to e7, I wanted to get rid of that pin so that that b5 move doesn't work anymore, so I'm not required to take it. I could just move my knight, but instead he just keeps attacking on the king side. I decided to try to simplify by exchanging off a pair of pawns on the queen side, but he didn't cooperate with that. But my knight can maneuver around a little bit, and the idea was now to try to get in b6 and have that be a stable formation. But I don't really have time. He plays f5, and I was really worried at this point about the f6 push with check, really restricting my king to the back rank here, and also getting the pawn to the 6th rank where it's quite dangerous. So I exchanged it off, and here I made a mistake. I think my best move, in fact, this is really the, well, probably not the losing move of the game. I mean, it's still holdable at this point. I exchanged off my e pawn for his f pawn to stop that, the pawn advance from happening. And then my h pawn is under attack, so I need to do something about that from the bishop, and so I have to push that. So I don't get a tempo here to organize things the way I would like to. And now he puts a second attack on my knight. And what I did to answer that, very hastily, was to play knight to e3, hoping that my knight was nice and centralized here. But this simply drops the b pawn, and with it the game. I had some reasonable chances of holding, I think, if I just played the knight to b6. And now my other knight can continue to hold the b pawn, and this knight is threatening to come into c5 with check and attacking his a pawn. But white is still better here. He just drops his bishop back to stop the check, and then I can trade off knights. Let's see if I go a little farther. Knight takes knight, king takes knight. It looks something like that, but with his bishop with pawns on both flanks, it's really a much better piece than the knight is. And plus my pawns, I have, assuming I can connect my pawns here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 pawn islands, and he only has 3 pawn islands, which would make, even if we had the same piece, even if we both had a knight, it makes my pawns harder to defend. And given that he has a bishop that can move quickly from one side to the other, it's quite a decent advantage for white. It's hard to hold. But after knight e6, now it gets ugly. I move my pawn out of harm's way, but he just moves his knight to a strong square in the center there. And I'm hoping to have that chance to at some point play knight c4 check, but he stops that with his bishop. Now I'm hoping maybe he'll play pawn takes pawn and I can take the knight, but of course that doesn't happen. Instead, just drops another pawn. He's going to win the h pawn. After he wins the f pawn, I have to advance the h pawn, otherwise he wins the h pawn. And now he just has time to play his knight into d6 again, and he has these 3 squares all held, and so there's no way for my king to get to his pawn. This is pretty tough here. What I was hoping at this point was that maybe I could hop around with my knights a little and get him with a check that he wouldn't see. But I was playing, in a matter of, trying to play within the time delay on the clock, so within my 5 seconds per move, and he was taking several minutes for each move, so he wasn't making mistakes. He was just playing it very well. So I was able to play knight check, thinking if he exchanged knights, at least I'd have a passed c pawn. I think he could have done that. Oh, in fact, he did do it. Okay. And then now his b pawn becomes a bit of a threat, except that, I mean, this was a little bit of a trap, I guess. It was the idea that it would be a threat, but it allows me to check and win the pawn. So I won back 1 pawn. Whoopee. But he gets the, meanwhile, gets the h pawn. And now I attack another pawn, but he's going to attack my c pawn. So I get the f pawn, and he gets the c pawn, and you kind of see what's happening is that I'm winning these pawns over here on the way over on the king side, and I'm never going to be able to get to the queen side to where he's winning pawns to stop them. I get a check, drop back with my knight into a more defensive posture, and I'm able to attack his pawn. I attack it again, he has to push it, I attack it again, he pushes it again, and now my king will be able to win that pawn, but you know, big deal because he can attack my a pawn and win it. I win the h pawn, he wins the a pawn. Okay, there's really not much to be said here because it's with the two pawns, you know, against two pawns and the bishop against the knight is just hopeless. He just keeps pushing that a pawn, and eventually I have to give up a piece. George Marajanian actually recorded about the last 30 moves in the game for me ever since about the time I got into a totally losing position. And so even at this point he couldn't keep up because they were playing so fast. And so Steve just kept pushing the a pawn until it promoted, and then with the queen he was able to checkmate me. It was pretty simple cleaning up for him. So he played a good game. I wish I'd gone ahead with that one combination that I analyzed to death, but didn't quite see how to make it work because it really was my best chance at that point. And after that, it was an even game, but I just got outplayed in the knight endgame. With knight and bishop, arguably, were a little stronger than knights, and I was a little cramped with my two knights. But I think black should definitely have been able to put up a stronger defense. So tough loss means I'll be way down on board something or other next week, but that's how it goes. And sometimes you lose them, and just gotta lick your wounds and get back in the fight. So see you next week from my game at the club.